Today on the show, we have historian Myke Cole, and this is an exciting conversation for me because we are going to dive into a pocket in history that it's so many of the things that I'm drawn to when I'm researching historical topics. It is a moment in time when military technology is evolving rather quickly, and people at the time have to evolve or die themselves in order to keep up with what's happening with this era of pike and shot warfare. But also it's a period in time when societal changes are evolving rapidly. If you're not aware, this story takes place during the English Civil Wars, a moment when England is facing the reality that the king is no longer the correct answer for their political issues. Charles I has become wildly unpopular to the point that there is a faction in England that is willing to depose him. And it's very difficult to put into words how insane that is for the period in time that they're living through. Because the king, for hundreds of years prior to this, for England, he is sacred. He is endowed by God. Like when they are crowned, the ceremony in which a king is crowned, there's this belief that there's like a supernatural thing going on that endows this man or this woman with the ability to rule England. It is insane for people to rebel against the king. So you've got that going on. You've also got this religious movement that is incredibly pious and very, very different than anything you would see today. And also, all that's going on here militarily is there's this evolving from heavy cavalry, from more traditional forms of pike and shot warfare to mobile cavalry, to lighter cavalry that ride through. And instead of, Myke Cole talks about this in the book, you have this Dutch form of fighting where cavalry rides against infantry kind of in this arc, and it's called a caracole, where the cavalry rides up and there's this constant stream of fire because as they're riding, they're firing their pistols at the infantry, and it's a steady stream. It's a constant riding around in circles. You fire your pistol at the infantry. As you're riding back, you reload, or you grab your other pistol, and you do this until you've softened them up, and then you draw swords and charge. The Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus changes this concept because the gun technology at the time, it's not exactly, these aren't accurate guns, to say the least. There's a pretty good chance that a lot of the shots being fired are going to miss in this caracole kind of tactic. So Gustavus Adolphus says, hey, our guns aren't super accurate far away. Let's get really close. So instead of the caracole, Gustavus Adolphus says, let's get all of our cavalry to the point where you are touching the enemy with your barrel of your pistol. Fire at them from inches away. You won't miss then. This is a Swedish iteration on the Dutch form of cavalry warfare. And Myke Cole, in his book, Steel Lobsters, examines this change from Dutch to Swedish cavalry fighting and how it affects everything, and how one guy gets caught in the middle of this evolving, style of military fighting, and how he's not up to the task of making the change. This guy is Sir Arthur Haselrige, and he outfits a famous group of cavalry called Sir Arthur Haselrige's Regiment of Horse, or Steel Lobsters, because they are outfitted in full armor. If you are to imagine an image of a knight from 1400s England, maybe somebody who fought at the Battle of Agincourt, right? Imagine a knight, give him some pistols. You've got Sir Arthur Haselrige's Regiment of Horse. This is high Middle Ages meets early modern warfare. It's crazy. You don't see that many pockets in military history where there's so obviously an evolution going on, but it's fascinating to examine the way things are changing. And what's so wild is in this societal upheaval, in this change about what does it mean to have a king, or what does it mean to have a parliament, or or these sorts of things. As all these questions are being thrown out there, Myke Cole posits in his book that Sir Arthur Haselrige is just as human as any of us. He's trying to prove he belongs. How do you prove that you belong in a period where warfare's changing, where society's changing? In Arthur Haselrige's case, he is an oligarch on the level of like an Elon Musk or a Bill Gates. He's rich. And how do you prove that you belong? You outfit your men in a flashy, super duper expensive, set of kit that's going to be recognizable on a battlefield. You set up to fight and, oh, look, there's the knights carrying guns. Those suits of armor, very expensive. Those horses, very expensive. And Sir Arthur Haselrige outfits his entire troop of horse from his own pocket. Supposedly, anyway. I'm sure there's a few of his men that have their own. And it's crazy, too, because it's not a uniform set of armor. Everybody will look a little bit different. And you get this early part of the English Civil Wars where people are still trying to figure out this evolution of pike and shot warfare, and Sir Arthur Haselrige is important, integral to William Waller's parliamentarian forces, but they come up against a lighter cavalry in the royalist forces. And this lighter cavalry fights in the Swedish fashion, where you ride up, point your gun, 2 inches from a guy's face and fire. You can't miss that way, right? Arthur Haselrige is fighting in the old, now slightly out-of-date Dutch fashion. And you get this kind of building up to a singular point, and the singular point is the Battle of Roundway Down, where Sir Arthur Haselrige and his Regiment of Horse are decimated by lighter cavalry that are riding in and firing at the touch. And it's so interesting to examine all the different ways and the psychology of Sir Arthur and how maybe his own upbringing is so important to why he founded this Regiment of Horse the way he did and why he outfitted them the way he did. And there's so much vanity in there, and there's also so much societal change. And it creates this cauldron of fascinating events. And Myke Cole examines all of these in his book, Steel Lobsters. I'm talking with him today, and I start this conversation out just by asking, what is it about Sir Arthur? What is it about this Regiment of Horse that led you to spend so much time diving into it? But I'll let Myke answer that for you. Myke, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start with... this is a pretty niche subject that you dive into here with Steel Lobsters. I'm just curious. It's fascinating, but I think I read maybe on the back cover or somewhere in the book, you spent 3 years of your life researching this subject. What is so fascinating to you about Arthur Haselrige, his Regiment of Horse, this specific pocket in the Pike and Shot era that you spent so much time diving into it?
Sure. So if you look at all my history, well, there's two rivers that are crossing here, right, in my life. The first is just growing up a fantasy and science fiction, Dungeons and Dragons, wargaming nerd, and that's all about mashups and X-wing versus TIE Fighter, Batman versus Superman. Who would win in a fight? I don't think you can have grown up being a nerd without having a lot of those conversations, and they persist into adulthood. And I don't know what is more in that vein than knights with guns. What would happen if knights had guns? But it turns out that that's not a fantasy question. That's 100 years of military history. And that brings me to the next sort of river that crosses here, which is what I call historical lacuna. Lacuna is a word that means gaps, right? Breaks in the record. You go into a bookstore and you look at the history section and you can be forgiven for thinking that everything's covered. Actually, the opposite is true. Almost everything is not covered. And one of the things I'm really proud of in my career is I've always looked for those places that people are not writing about it. You can have your 85th history of the American Civil War. Like there's plenty of that. And I'm not knocking it, right? It's actually very challenging to find new angles in those fields. I don't want to come across as being critical. I'm not. But I'm more interested in things that people are not writing about at all. So my first book, Legion versus Phalanx, which talks about the Roman legion fighting the Greek, I use that in quotes, it's really Balkan Hellenistic phalanx. I wrote that book because I couldn't find one. I wanted to read it, and one didn't exist. And, proving that the Spartans were not super badass warriors is kind of top 40 now. Everybody does it. I don't want to flatter myself that I was the first to do it, but I do think that the comprehensiveness of the Bronze Lie was pretty groundbreaking at the time I wrote it. Because I was looking around, right? Trump was coming up for the first time. There was a lot of Sparta references in politics. If you were following British Parliament, there were the Spartans there. And no one was really writing about that in a consistent way. No one had done a scorecard. Well, if the Spartans are so tough, let's count the battles. Like, did they win or did they not? And that was the hole I was filling there. And then with Steel Lobsters, it's the same thing. I got really into Pike and Shot wargaming, tabletop wargaming with, little toy soldiers. And what I was really energized by was there's 100-year period, really a century of warfare, where the medieval and the modern are on the same battlefield. You have order-drilled musketeers and armored lancers. Think about that, Pike and Shot. You have a medieval technology, right? No different than the Scottish schiltron or the Swiss pikemen and halberdiers. And they're working to keep cavalry off of musketeers. Like, that is so cool.
Yeah.
And no one writes about it. There's no good luck. Go to Barnes and Nobles. Try to find a book on that. There's maybe one or two. Or you can find them, but they're really academic. They're not written in a breezy magazine style that's, gridiron, and that's aimed at people who are not scholars and not looking to be scholarly. So I saw that, I fell in love with it, and then once I got into the story's on its own merits is just amazing, and that's really what got me going.
It's so funny because I also was trying to find more information about Pike and Shot stuff, and you're 100% correct. There's not much. There's a book here and there, and you can find grand sweeping sorts of things where it goes, the Pike and Shot era begins, let's say, I don't know, 1500 something, and we're going to end this abruptly 1700. And we're going to do a grand sweeping book that's this big time period, but we don't get into maybe the meat and potatoes of some of it. So it was refreshing to see this, because it is, I think it's a study in cavalry, right? It's really heavily armored cavalry, knights meeting mobile cavalry. And how does that work? Yep. And the combinations thereof. And I think you pointed out in Steel Lobsters that there's this change happening. Nobody knows it's happening. Well, I take that back. Haselrige doesn't know it's happening. Other people are picking up on it. But right. Just talk about this difference between the heavy cavalry knights carrying pistols, but also this new sweeping change in Europe where you have mobile cavalry, and how those two unit types kind of come against each other.
Sure. And what's so cool about this, Josh, and we don't have time to go into it in a way that gives it justice, is it's also a social handoff, right?
Yeah.
Society is just, and what's so incredible is it's such a cool corollary for our own time. I don't know if you looked out the window or read a newspaper. I mean, I'm sorry, newspapers don't exist anymore. Man, did I hate myself. I don't know if you've gone on Google News, but the world is on fire, dude. It's crazy how fast things are going. And when you add Gen I into it, I spend a lot of time really anxious, but I also spend a lot of time when I'm able to step back from that anxiety and look. We are living through, we're approaching the singularity. It's incredible, the speed of change. And that level of upheaval is the world that Sir Arthur Haselrige is living in. You have this old ordered medieval aristocracy that's based on land. And this phenomenon that you and I take for granted, that a man rises by his skills, right? As a merchant, as a lawyer, as the Jeff Bezos and of our day, as a writer, as an entertainer, to the point where you have the wealth and political power to punch at the same level as a count or a duke. Man, in the 1600s, that was bananas. That was oh my God, what are we going to do? And that's the world that Sir Arthur Haselrige found himself in. And what's so cool is that expressed itself in the military technology that was used. So you're right, that light cavalry, that mobile cavalry, the harquebusier. So we're talking about a dude in a buff coat, like a big thick leather coat with a sword and pistols, and he might have a breast and a backplate and a helmet, but you wouldn't call him fully armored, coming up against completely armored men, fully armored knights that instead of having lances are using pistols. And what's so fascinating about that, and I make this point in the book, is that it's apparent almost immediately that is a bad decision to wear that full armor, right? That's just not working. And by the time Sir Arthur Haselrige raises his regiment of lobsters, it's already apparent. I mean, clearly not to him. So one of the big questions I ask in the book is, this dude is not stupid. Why is he doing it? And one of the conclusions I reach, I mean, there's some personal conclusions I reach about his life and the trauma that he suffered. But I also reach the conclusion that this guy is assuming the role of the knights that ran his life, right? These landed lords that antagonized his religious community, that kept his dad down, the whole community. And he's trying to show them, I can punch at your weight, and I can prove it, because the most expensive thing in the world is armor and a horse, and I can afford it too. Not only can I afford it, I can afford to equip all of my people in it. We will look just like you do, to show that we can assume the same power that you have. But of course, it turns out to be a really, really tragic move, but so beautifully human, right? Like, so cool.
Yeah. I think at one point in the book, you point out how expensive one of these suits of armor are, and then the stuff that comes along with it, with your horse, and you got to have spare horses and all these things.
Yep.
Put in perspective how absurdly expensive this is, and not just for him, for his whole unit.
Right. So, okay, this is always really tough. It's like estimating purchasing power is more of an art than a science. But let's just say off the bat that these guys are the oligarchs of our day. One of the points I try to make out at the beginning of the book is, because Sir Arthur is this non-noble parliamentarian rebel fighting against the king and the lords. I'm like, let me disabuse you of the notion that this is some working class hero fighting the man. No, this is like Elon Musk fighting Donald Trump. These are like, he is super rich, right? Like, super rich. And in fact, the expense isn't just to him, because while I point out that some of the troopers show up in his unit with their own gear, in fact, that's a lot more common among super heavy cavalry of the kind of people he recruits. For a lot of them, he's equipping them. So he's paying out of his own purse. So the only way I can say to try to give people a modern perspective is you have to think of Sir Arthur Haselrige as a Mark Andreessen, as an Andy Karp, as an Elon Musk. Like, he's that level. He is a bazillionaire. There's actually, we live in a new Gilded Age, so that's probably a bit extreme. But the point is, if you're a normal human being, by any, even a very successful one, you cannot afford to do what Sir Arthur Haselrige.
So you start out the book by showing us a battle where Gustavus Adolphus, the king of Sweden, iterates on pike and shot warfare in a way that people who are paying attention will have noticed what he's doing differently here than what people have done prior. What is this change, and why is it important to the English Civil Wars?
Okay, so a few things here which just tickle me. Most people don't know that Sweden was once a military world power that people were like really terrified of.
I was tickled that you had a whole section here about Gustavus Adolphus. I was like, oh, this is awesome. I love this.
Are you sure? Like, we knew about the Vikings, but like Sweden?
Yeah, right.
Sweden. They were, in fact, I would actually argue that if Adolphus hadn't been killed right after Breitenfeld, because he was herring off, and he was the real deal, right? You have a lot of kings that are celebrated as, he was called the Lion of the North. He really was a badass in the mold of Alexander the Great. And he just so happened to catch a bullet, or he would have, actually, I'm not sure it was a bullet, don't quote me on that, but he was killed in battle. And if that hadn't happened, who knows? where Sweden might have been today. But this is really fascinating, and it dovetails into, because you have to remember the first two books I wrote are books on ancient warfare. And one of the things that occurred with Maurice of Orange, who's the great leader in what today we call the Netherlands, was this backward look at ancient warfare and an attempt to revive it. And that you see a lot of this in the phalanx, right, of these pikemen, and incorporating firepower into that. And one of the things that Maurice of Orange established, which was not known this at the time, but modern scholars call it the Dutch school of pike and shot warfare, and that is a reliance on firepower. And it's what you think it is. It's rotating lines of musketeers. You have this thing in horsemanship called the caracole, which is from the Spanish word for snail. But it's the same idea. It's sort of like the ancient idea of the Cantabrian circle. It's just horsemen riding up, firing their pistols, riding back. Next horseman in line is doing the same. And what this is doing is it's a constant withering line of fire. Eventually, the opposing formation starts to waver because they've been hit by a lot of bullets, which is painful and causes fear. And when you look, the commander says, well, they look messed up enough. Then you draw swords and charge, right? And there's a similar thing happening on foot, and that reliance on firepower. What Gustavus Adolphus innovates here, and I'm crediting him individually, which is, we all know it's his command staff. He's building on traditions. I just want to put that caveat there. I'm sure he didn't sit up in bed and go, Eureka. You know? But his experience fighting the Poles. So the Polish winged hussar, and you've got to Google these guys if you haven't already. I say that to your listeners and watchers. Yep, they wore wings. It's not a joke. It's amazing. And they're most famously deployed in 1683 at the Battle of Kaliningrad, which lifts the siege of Vienna from the Ottoman Turks. You want to talk about an underserved period of history. It's one of the most dramatic stories in warfare. And if not for that battle, you and I would both be Muslims. There's only one book on it, Enemy at the Gates, by Andrew Wheatcroft. The only one popular book. You cannot find books on it. It's incredible. Well, anyway, Adolphus, using the Dutch school, encountered these heavy lancers and discovered that, when you're caracoling and presenting and firing pistols, you killed 2 or 3 guys and they're galloping at you, and then they're in amongst you and you're being torn apart by lances and sabers once they get in. And those very, very difficult lessons, learned more by his father, but also by himself, caused him to iterate on this idea. All right, well, we have these pistols. These lances are extremely long. Rather than hang back here and try to rely on firepower, which doesn't deliver enough bullets before these guys hit us, why don't we hold our fire, charge in there? Yes, a few of us are going to get lanced and taken out of the saddle, but then we're in there and we fire at point blank. We put the pistol on the body and pull the trigger, and then we're not going to miss. And keep in mind, most of the weapons back then are smoothbore, right? Which means I can fire, let me point this way. I can fire this, my bullet's going to go that way, right? Because of the, oh gosh, I forgot the name of the effect. It has to do with air pressure on a smooth, round surface. I talk about it in the book. And this seems very simple. But when you're dealing with that kind of firearms technology, they are able to fight the Poles after really losing badly to them at the Truce of Altmark to a treaty that favors Sweden. And this Swedish school, it's very simple. Charge straight in to impact, close combat, and fire at the touch. Barrel on the head, barrel on the belly, barrel on the thigh, barrel on the horse. You're not going to miss. You're also going to have much less of a chance of the round attenuating over distance. Remember, these are 17th century firearms. The bullets don't have anywhere near as much power behind them as modern ones. And that tactic, which is so successful at Breitenfeld, it's legendary. And believe me, people are singing about this in alehouses all over Europe. And really serious tactical commanders, like Prince Rupert and Prince Maurice, who are Charles I's cavalry commanders and his nephews, they're paying attention. And you see that. You really do. And you see it specifically in the matchups between the royalists and the parliamentarians, the rebels, of whom Sir Arthur Haselrige was a member, with just devastating effect.
I was trying to imagine just kind of like what it's like to watch this happen, right? Where these guys are riding up and shooting people in the head point blank. And I guess, spoiler for history, right? Sir Arthur takes this in the head, like, how many times was it?
He gets shot in the
Several.
head twice, and he gets shot a total of 4 times and stabbed a whole bunch of times, and he's okay.
Incredible.
When Charles I hears about this, he goes, how do I translate this into modern English? He goes, man, if that dude had had food, if he had had as much food as well as he was protected, he could have withstood a siege of 7 days or something like that. Or 7 years or something crazy. Like, Charles was just like, are you kidding me, when he heard this story? But
it's
it also
incredible.
goes to show you, look, that's not going to happen to everybody. Arthur Haselrige's a rich man. He could afford some very good armor.
Right.
But, people ask that question, was armor ever effective against bullets? And in that one-on-one duel between Sir Arthur and Richard Atkins, oh yeah, it was. It really was.
So Pike and Shot is, I think what's fascinating for me is it's this pocket in time when things are changing really rapidly and people at the time have to kind of get on board or suffer the consequences. In this case, you have all these wars happening, tons and tons and tons of people die, at least for the time. It's also a time, and it's something you pointed out in the book, and it's something that I hadn't really thought about a ton. You have a lot of medieval sensibilities that are still very, very present in society. And so the English Civil Wars are like a microcosm for some of these changes societally as well as militarily. Like, my example is the New Model Army starts promoting people based on merit, not by their social station. It's radical stuff. And it's Oliver Cromwell is like nuts to a lot of his contemporaries because he's doing some of this stuff. Yep. And he goes down in history as a madman because of some of these policies that we now think are like totally normal and fine.
Yep.
Talk about some of this just like wild change societally, because it all dovetails together, and you point this out in the book.
Sure, and you have some of these like amazing moments in it too. But yes, like the idea that you should be equipped. You don't pay for your own stuff. Like that your equipment should be standard. In other words, the idea of a uniform. This is one of the things that's so I love about Osprey. So Osprey is the specialty publisher that publishes my work. I'm one of the few. They're expanding now, authors that do like these large hardcover books that are in normal bookstores. But Osprey built their name on these little, slim, highly illustrated books that people use to paint toy soldiers. And that's the only way you can get, detailed, specific books like this in. But one of the great things they do is they do reconstructed illustrations. And if you look at the color plates in Steel Lobsters, that's what the book is full of. And what I love about those, the way that we do those illustrations when you work for Osprey is they hire an amazing painter like Richard Hook. And then you are emailing this poor person, again and again and again, hey, no, move the button here. That's not what the sword should look like. This is what the sword should look like. And those poor, long-suffering artists get it perfect. But one of the wonderful things that I really like about one of the images is they show the lobsters at Roundway Down. And it's these armored men with their guns, and they're all totally different. One of them has black armor. One of them has russet armor. One of them doesn't have a helmet. One of them has a more modern helmet with an open face. Everything is different. And there's a wonderful picture. I think I have it also in Steel Lobsters that you have this sort of very modern, for the period, contemporary cuirassier putting on his armor, and behind him is another guy. He's a cavalryman. He's putting on an infantry morion. That's the helmet with a big comb on it that you see a lot of pikemen wear that has a totally open face, not appropriate for horse work, much, much older period than what's going on. And that artist does a great job of capturing that, like, this is still medieval. There's this levy culture that you grab what you can. You have your granddad's gear that's sitting in the barn, and when the horn sounds, you go and get it. One of the things that's so fascinating is that England's main, military force were these trained bands, these local militias that were Elizabethan. So, and this is incredible because this is really no different than the way hoplites fought in ancient Greece. You're a farmer, and like once a month after church, everybody gets together on the town green, and there's this one crusty old dude who's like 80, and he fought in a war, a million years ago, and he like lines you all up, and he seems to know what he's doing, and you kind of And he's like, all right, remember that. You're going to need it. And you don't believe him. And then you go back to whatever it is you're doing, shearing sheep, harvesting wheat. And then one of these days, like, they cry someone like rides out and is like, no, there's actually a war now. And you grab this rusty crap, if you even still have it. You might have gambled and, use it to pay your gambling debts or whatever. You got, your pike is being used to grow beans.
Right.
And it's rusty, right? You grab this thing, you forgot everything, and you show up at that field and you wait for someone to tell you what to do, and that's warfare. And this idea that, no, soldiering is a profession, and not just a profession for barons and counts. Like, this is no different than being a lawyer. It's what you dedicate your life to, and you become good at it. And when you're not fighting, you train to fight. And that idea is bananas. And the new model army really is. And what's so amazing, I'm so glad you brought that up. And then, I was actually funny because I looked into maybe writing about it, but like, new model army is definitely one of those things where there's no shortage of books on it. So not a lot for me to do there. But that idea, our whole modern military, the military I served in, right? The whole American concept, this thing that has made us this immense imperial power, that's the origin of it. That regularization. And the only comparable thing I can really think of, some medievalists are going to get mad at me because I know Charles the Bold did something similar with his army de Lodits, but really it's ancient Rome. That's really where you see that kind of standardization. But in the modern sense, yes, the new model army really is the thing that shifted it, and we've never shifted back.
Pike and Shot, again, compressed period of time, but there's several different periods, at least that I've read, and I think you would know a hell of a lot more about this than I would, but there's minor changes several different times throughout the period. It starts out, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's Swedish pikemen, or no, sorry, Swiss pikemen. It's Swiss pikemen, and then evolves into like pretty recognizable, like the Revolutionary War is kind of an offshoot. It's a progression of what we arrive at by the end of the Pike and Shot era. What are like the major kind of overarching themes of where we start at and how we get to, Cornwallis and Nathaniel Greene kind of things? Sure.
So, and I'll be practicing 18th century history without a license, but I'll expand that much larger. One of the things it's so fascinating to me about weaponry and warfare is it is both innovative and incredibly conservative at the same time. And a great example of this is, man, I haven't carried a pistol in a long time, but I carried 1911 plenty of times. It's called 1911 because it was made in 1911, and I was carrying it, a few years ago, right? And why? Because it's a great design, and the SOCOM, the M1, that's just with the wood off and the carbon graphite on. It's the same M1 they ran in World War II. But that's a great long gun. And I still, I'm very lucky I will never have to carry a long gun again, but I hope not. But man, I will take that thing over an HK416, over any kind of AR-style weapon, over any AK. Like, that's an amazing gun. It's from World War II. Actually, it's from before World War II. So there's a lot of things that are very constant. So when you talk about Pike and Shot, I actually have to take you all the way back to ancient Sumer, right? What a pike keel, which is the term for a large block of dudes with pikes or halberds is, it is a phalanx. That is what it is. And the innovation of musketry and the adding of musketry to that does not change that fact. All a phalanx is the bright idea, which predates civilization practically, that if you take a bunch of guys with pointy sticks and you stand them shoulder to shoulder and you point the pointy sticks in one direction, that tends to work.
Yep.
And there's lots of innovations on it. But when you think about it, the pike's a little longer, which allows you to turn sideways, which allows more density of points and a longer weapon. But that's certainly not unique or new to the Swiss. That's something that has been practiced and innovated in the Hellenistic age, right? We talk about going from the hoplite formation with the aspis, the round shield, and the 9-foot dory, held over your shoulder or underarm, to the pike held in two hands with the peltée hung off the shoulder, which is, it long predates Alexander the Great, but what Plutarch would say, armed in the Macedonian manner, right? There isn't a lot of difference there. So I would actually argue that that's not something that the Swiss innovated, right? That's something that is held over all the way from the ancient world. Now, there's the dominance of cavalry that we can talk about that rises in at the end of the ancient world and into the medieval world. And the other thing, too, is it's very important not to fall into the trap of what we call technological determinism, this idea that great swings in history turn on single things like the sweep of technology. I think that, and again, I'd be practicing medievalism without a license here. I know that Michael Livingston, who is my mentor and dear friend and co-authored The Killing Ground with me, he'll watch this and he's definitely going to let me have it. But so when we talk about why cavalry were dominant in the age of the knight, right, in what we commonly think of as the High Middle Ages, a lot of those reasons are social and financial, right, as well as tactical and military. But what I think that notion of the phalanx has always been effective. There was something called the Infantry Revolution, which occurred in the later Middle Ages. And the best author to read on that is Kelly DeVries, who's another friend of mine and a dear, dear friend of Mike's. I can't remember if he has a book specifically on the Infantry Revolution, but I know he's written just very, very convincingly on it. But really one of the things I was struck by is that these currents that you're seeing, right, that the cohesion of a formation, the ability for many, many men to act in a single unit, and also the effect that has on morale because unit cohesion, ultimately battlefield success, and I don't think this is even arguable, at least, it's certainly changed now because the individual action of warriors has been really empowered by modern technology, but really up until very recently, including the 18th century, which you mentioned, the ability for men to stay cohered, right, to fight as a block, that's what turns warfare. And what cracks that? The erosion of morale. And one of the great stabilizers of morale is when I look to my left, I see Josh. And Josh is looking straight ahead, and I don't want to let that dude down. And so I'm not going to run because he's not running. I'm not kidding. It's that basic. And what's so fascinating, I've had this experience in war, but I've been in the fire service now coming up on 5 years. And that sense, right, when you're on a hose team and you're pushing in and I don't know how to describe it to you, Josh, you can't see anything. A lot of people think firefighting is done standing up. It's not. You're crawling on your stomach and you can't see shit. Oh, can I curse on your?
Yeah.
Okay. But you can't see anything, and it's scary, man. And we're volunteers, right? And so oftentimes I'm back up on a hose line. The dude in front of me is some idiot, who I don't particularly like, actually, I may not particularly like, but who I actually love because you feel this incredible bond. But I'll tell you, when I get scared, and I get scared, I really do. The only thing I think is, oh my God, I am not letting this person see me scared. I am not going to, be slow moving this hose. I'm not going to, give anyone any reason to doubt me. And that sense, it's the exact same internality that I think someone in a pike and shot block would have felt. Because think about it, man, you got to stand there holding your pike. And I try to describe this in Push a Pike. When pike blocks come together, right? Think about it. If you're in the third rank, there is nowhere for you to go.
Right.
And all you are doing is holding this thing, and you are slowly moving forward. And I'm not kidding. You're going to look down. You're going to see a pike come into your armpit. You cannot move. And it's coming up over your breastplate. It's coming into the part that's not protected. It's pushing into your body, and there is absolutely nothing you can do. Now try to imagine the internality that enables you to do that, to get into that thing and hold position. And that secret sauce, that has been the difference between what we consider to be elite warriors and, green fighters going all the way back to the ancient world.
Yeah. You brought up technological determinism, which this is something, it's, I guess, somewhat unrelated, but kind of related. I've been stewing on this for a while. There's a book that was written a few years ago about this idea that technology didn't change so rapidly until, after Waterloo. You start seeing battlefield technology evolve pretty quickly till like World War One. But the idea was thrown out there that, what if Alexander the Great is at Waterloo and his Macedonians? How would they do? And you would think, like, knee-jerk reaction, they'd get absolutely destroyed. The book posits the idea maybe Alexander the Great and his Macedonian army would not do any worse than Napoleon did at Waterloo, because technology hadn't changed so drastically that they'd just be wasted away before they can do what they're going to do. But it's a very well taken point that infantry that are super well trained, it never lose guys. I think there's somebody has said this, and it's been repeated several times. He only lost like 1,000 guys in battle because they never lost. And if you never are forced to rout, you don't lose all that many guys because, you lose all your soldiers in the rout.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's a great question, but I think like the bigger and cooler question, and also the more impossible question is that it's not just technology and morale. It's the stories human beings tell ourselves about who we are. So, one of the points I try to make about Sir Arthur is that, like, this guy made a terrible decision, right, about how to arm his unit. And it made for a great story, but it's a tragedy. And he's a smart man and a veteran, and he made a stupid decision. Why? Because his own ego and what it meant to him to be a noble, to be a knight, to wear the armor, right? That was so powerful that he couldn't break free of it. So I'll give you another example. I just got back from Peru. Josh, go to Peru.
That sounds amazing. I'm on board.
You should totally go to Peru. Go to Machu Picchu. Like, all I can say, I've been all around the world, man. I was in Machu Picchu, and I had this sense of, like, this has to be a Disney set. I could not believe it was real. It's just incredible. But, of course, like, everywhere I go, I learn about military history. And, of course, the story of Pizarro and the Incas is sort of the same as the story of that Bernal Diaz de Castillo. By the way, if you haven't read Bernal Diaz de Castillo's account of Cortez and Montezuma and the conquest of Mexico, read that, dude. It's good. It's one of those there are primary sources that you need a weed whacker to, you're doing work. Not this one. You're going to love it. And one of the things you realize very quickly is, I mean, the conquistadors, both in Peru and in Mexico, were outnumbered to the point where I don't care if these dudes are just fighting with their teeth. Why are the Spaniards winning?
Right.
And you see how much it has to do with the cosmology that the Aztecs and the Tlaxcalans and the Incas believe in, and how their belief in what a monster is and what a god is and what a human's relationship is to those things. Fatalism, what it means to die, what it means to surrender, what it means to be a man. What dishonor is, what ownership is, what gold means, like all of these things. And also internal divisions that rack those indigenous societies, right? And how that interplays with Spanish religion and what a guy looks like what blue eyes mean. All of these big questions. And you can't consider the outcome of a battle without considering all of that. So we talk about the veteranness of Alexander's hypaspists. We talk about the technology they were using. But, like, what does a 3rd century BC Hellenistic man think? I don't know, when he sees a woman in a hoop dress. What does he think of a wagon with wheels? What does he think of Christianity? What does he think of chewing tobacco? Like, I mean, all of that is going to play into who wins. And those kinds of questions, because they're social questions. Those are questions that military historians often, like, we don't really get into. I know I'm going on. Let me say one more thing. When I was in Pylos researching the Bronze Lie, they have an archaeological museum in there. And I went in there, and they had a endometriosis treatment hot water bottle. So it was shaped like a woman's pelvis, had like a curve. It was clearly designed to rest on the mons pubis. And it was a clay flask with a stopper. And the only reason they knew what it did is it was buried as a grave good in its correct location. And when you see the shape and you see where it was on the skeleton, you know that that's what it was for. It was to, provide heat to reduce endometrial pain or menstrual pain. And I was just like, and I just realized, I was like, you know what, man, they saved the arms and armor. They throw that shit away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The fact that there's one of those, because if there's one of those, there were a million of them.
Yeah.
Nobody saved them. Nobody saved them. And so like, that's the kind of like interdisciplinary stuff that we need.
Yeah. Well, not to make it more military stuff.
That's what we're here for.
I was wondering while reading the book, we talk about this change from heavy knights that fight a certain way to mobile cavalry that fight in the Swedish way of riding up, touching the pistol to the body and firing. What is, I guess reading it, I was wondering, okay, what's the eventual counter to that? What is the eventual iteration to what Gustavus Adolphus's iteration was of having light mobile cavalry come up and just put pistols on people's faces?
Sure. Well, so, and here I will freely admit, so now you're getting into 18th century innovation and the future of cavalry. And Josh, I don't know. I did not, that is not my purview. I will say there are some obvious suspicions. One is the improvements in firearms technology and locking mechanisms,
right,
in their reliability. You also have the advent of rifling, which makes them more accurate. So why the heck would you wait, to go up? If your rounds, I talk about this in the book. We have the expression, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes, which is not from Bunker Hill. And I talk about what it's from. It's actually from the British Navy in an earlier period. But there's a reason they say that, right? Because most people get nervous and fire too high. Like you have these incredibly inaccurate weapons that have, pretty poor range. Well, once that, so a lot of that at the touch placement of the round, plus you have improvements in sighting technology. So once you have rifling and barrels, that's at least more common. I would imagine, I do not know, but I would imagine that would make a difference.
Yeah.
But look, this is important, Josh, and I do find it frustrating. And it's what I call the Jordan Peterson effect. I actually really admire Jordan Peterson. This is not a knock on Jordan Peterson. But one of the things that Jordan Peterson does that I do find frustrating is his background is in psychology and psychoanalysis, I believe. And this guy will, give a 2-hour lecture on economics and space travel and whatever. And I'm always like, look, I find you fascinating and I'm so glad to hear your perspective, but how about a caveat that this is not your field?
Right.
And you don't get that. And this is also super important when you talk about the study of history. One of the things, I definitely have insecurity. I don't have a PhD, and I'm unlikely to get one at this phase in my life. But I have tremendous respect for the discipline of academia and rely on it. And one of the things that is often said among PhD students is that the process of getting a PhD is to know more and more about less and less. And that dialing in is really, really critical. And so for me, that's one of the reasons why this book took 3 years, right? Is that, I'm moving from the ancient world. I certainly will stand up on a stage and say, I am an expert in warfare. I'm an historian, right? Those things. But when you peel back the onion, what have I really developed expertise on? Heavy infantry combat in the Hellenistic age, Sparta specifically, right? Ancient Sparta. Now, because of my co-authored book with Mike Livingston, The Killing Brown, one battlefield, Thermopylae. And now this unit in this war under this man. Certainly the background that comes with it is important, and I certainly do my homework. But I do wish that historians and people in general would turn to the camera when they're asked and be like, well, I'm practicing medieval history here without a license. Yeah. I do think that's important. I think people don't do it. I think that some of it's ego. Some of it's also like, if I say I don't know enough, people are going to be like, what do I need you for?
Yeah.
But I also think, and this is one of the things that's really kind of sad, is that I don't think anybody would deny that since like 2015, 2016 and the rise of social media, we've entered a really combative and unkind public square.
Yep.
Where no one ever wants to say they're sorry and no one ever wants to admit they're wrong because the consequences of that are unspeakable. So let me be the change I wish to see and tell you and your listeners I have no idea.
I love that you bring that up because I'm no historian. I'm a guy who likes history. I'm a guy who happens to know how to make podcasts. And so those two things have kind of married up. And I'm trying to approach this thing from, I don't know everything there is to know. I try to do, these series that try and cover grand scope topics, but how granular can you really go when you're not an expert on some of these things? You read 15, 20 books about something, a pretty good idea about, what it is you're talking about, but you're not an expert. And I find it fascinating the discourse about academia and scholarly work where it's different than trying to bring awareness to a period and say, here's all the context, here's all the cool things about it, here's all, these things. You dive into the history a little bit, but obviously there's a line there where I think I've read it or maybe heard it that somebody says people who are interested in history know how really hard it is to be a historian. Like there's another level to it that you have to go to with study that is intense. I'm curious your approach. You have written scholarly stuff. You have written intense, deep dive, granular stuff. Yeah. But how does that, is there like an imposter syndrome thing where you're like, there's certainly a point where I won't go?
Yeah, I've been attacked for it. Like one of my great heroes in ancient Sparta was Paul Cartledge. I grew up reading his stuff, and like a lot of my love of Sparta and interest in Sparta came from him. He's wrong. He's one of the worst perpetuators of the bronze lie, saying how great Sparta was. And I realized that very quickly. And when I wrote the bronze lie, I basically tore down his work. I didn't name him. I just made the point that, hey, the Spartans weren't that tough. He's also very close with Petros Doukas, who's the mayor of Sparta, who made him an honorary citizen. So, of course, he had to and Petros Doukas is a right-wing politician in Greece. Yeah. So when you say the Spartans weren't tough, he's a Trumpian figure. You're kind of kicking a hornet's nest. So Paul Cartledge came after me in the British press, big newspapers, UK, I think it was the Daily Express. And he said he didn't attack my work. He talked about me personally. Yeah. Well, this guy's a novelist. He had an alarming career, in professional violence, and I was just like, what the fuck, dude? What are you doing? And I realized, and one of the things he kept attacking was, he's a non-scholar. He's a non-scholar. And I'm like, hey, how about you talk about my work?
Yeah.
Because I'm right, right? Because I wrote a book that so it was fascinating to come up against that. It was really painful because that guy was a hero to me. In fact, I went and gave a paper in Sparta, and he said something to me in the hallway, and I just pretended I didn't hear it because I didn't trust myself. Yeah. And I don't want to get into it with that would not be a good look, getting into it at an academic conference with the most famous professor on Sparta. But the fact that I also took some comfort because he attacked my credentials. Yeah. And not what I said. And that's your surefire indicator that you're onto something. But to your question, first off, I think that some people kind of lean into the bad boy, I'm an independent researcher. I'm not like these ivory tower academics. I don't have any use for that. There is a mile of daylight between me. I absolutely have a lot of pride in my work, and I do a lot of hard work, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the things I've done. And someone like Mike Livingston, who has dedicated his life full-time to this. I am an historian. I am not a PhD professor of history. There is a big difference. And anyone who dismisses people who dedicate their lives to this, that's just shows a lack of seriousness. So I think you need both. I am a strong enough scholar and have enough respect for the academy and deference to the academy that I do good work. And then what do I bring to the table? I'm a novelist. I bring I bring the action, I bring the cool story, I bring, and I write for magazines, I write for big major newspapers, and that breezy Rolling Stone, if you read that duel between Sir Arthur Haselrige and Richard Atkins in Steel Lobsters, like, you're not going to find that in academic journals, right? There are academic historians like Mike Livingston who do write like that. They're amazing, but they're rare, right? That's a whole separate skill. But let me say this. When I wrote Legion versus Phalanx, I learned Latin and Greek. I learned those languages because you need those languages, because history is not history, history is languages. And one of the reasons why I didn't write about the siege in Vienna in 1683 is I didn't have the languages. There's a reason I picked the English Civil War, because with French, German, English, Latin, and Greek, I can get by and do my own translations and do the source work. That is critical. The difference between historians who are, I don't know, like D.B. Cooper, this guy, this right-wing darling who's saying that Hitler's fine. Jesus, that makes me crazy.
I wasn't going to drag you into that hot water because it's so fascinating on so many levels. But I almost was, when you're talking about this, I'm wondering like, oh man, I wonder if you've.
Yeah,
I know everybody's seen it, but
look, Victor Davis Hanson ripped that guy a new asshole.
Yes.
He my, so the difference between a guy like that and me is that, like, I understand historiography. I have a master's in history. And my dad, when I went to college, gave me Mark Bloch's A Life in History. Like, I learned historiography, how you cite sources, how you interrogate sources. I've also lived my whole life as a police officer, police investigator, an intelligence officer, doing investigation, interrogating sources, doubting things, checking things, which really are applicable skills. Not that that substitutes for a PhD. I'm not claiming that. But that example of the languages, and I'll never forget, I went to my agent, my novel agent at the time, and said, hey, I want to write this book. And, this dude, I'm not a big fan of him. But one of the things, you can't do that. You're not a scholar. And I was like, oh, really? Tell me what I can't do. And then I sat my ass down, and I learned Latin and Greek. And that action, right, understanding that you must do your own translations, that translations are an art and not a science, and that you could, if you rely, I'll give you one example. One of the leading translators describing the sarissa, the Macedonian infantry pike, called it a lance. I mean, if I had trusted that translation, Josh, think about how significantly that one detail affects every battle that Alexander the Great ever fought. If I thought that that was a lance and not a 21-foot-long infantry pike.
Yeah.
This is what I mean. So that I do go an extra mile is my point. But again, I want to reiterate, you cannot compare me. Look, I'm not a fan of Paul Cartledge. I just told you what a jerk that guy was to me. But I don't compare myself to him. That man is a real scholar and I am not. And it's very, very important to understand the amount of labor that goes into those respective qualifications.
Yeah. This is, I guess, another aside, but the things that draw me to history are a couple different things. It's when you put human beings in severely adverse situations and you just see them respond to them. That's endlessly fascinating. The other thing is that often historians disagree, like you just said. Yeah. And that part of it is also really fascinating because they can, at least from my experience reading them, disagree about things. They disagree for lots and lots of different reasons. They might disagree because they're writing things to appease a king. They might disagree because there's like a scholarly disagreement about source text. They might disagree because, I think I was reading a thing about ancient infantry warfare, and one guy went out and walked the battlefield, and he was like, yeah, this guy's wrong because I walked it, and like you physically can't move the way he says these guys move. And like
sure.
That sort of thing to me is crazy, crazy fascinating. What is historiography something that like people get excited about, or is that just like a super nerd thing?
Well, so here's what it is something that people get super excited about, but they don't know it's historiography. They're calling it something else. every investigative reality TV show that you have ever seen, true crime, I think it may still be the #1 podcast topic. And podcasts are pretty popular, dude. That's a lot of people listening to a lot of hours, right? It captures people's imagination. And alien stories, I do reality TV. I'm finally doing history reality TV. In fact, I should be shooting something for the History Channel next week. And it's like ancient apocalypse, undiscovered civilizations, all of this stuff. And all of those are orbiting the same thing, which is that human beings, look, we're meaning-making machines. The world is chaotic, it's confusing, and we look at it and we try to make it make sense. So this sense of discovering truth, of solving the puzzle, of figuring out what really happened is one of the most spiritually satisfying experiences a human being can have. It's what's at the basis of religion. The most profound experiences I have in life. I'm a deeply religious person, by the way. That's a recent development. But the most profound experiences I have in that is when I feel that I am, how do I say this? Not precisely understanding, but experiencing the real functioning of the universe. And that's what keeps me coming back to religious ritual and religious practice. So when you talk about historiography, interrogating sources, learning languages, knowing what everybody else said and sifting through counting arts, walking the battlefield, putting on the armor and fighting to answer the questions, that is endlessly satisfying because you are peeling back the layers of mystery and you are understanding what's true.
Yeah. And
that is human, universal, and it is the most profoundly satisfying and wonderful experience people can have. Yeah. And the only thing better than that, and this is next level, is accepting that you will never know the truth.
Right. Yeah. No, that's I've been working on a series on the Vietnam War, and the thing that I'm realizing is the truth is somewhere in this gray area of interpretation between what one side says and the other side says, and both of them are lying.
You're right. That's right. And accepting that is great. But look, I mean, it's wonderful debating it endlessly, which is what history is.
So to close things out here, Arthur Haselrige, as we mentioned, takes several shots to the body. He gets battered and they lose the Battle of Roundway Down. But in the long run, the parliamentarians, they win the English Civil Wars. King Charles is executed. It is insanity, and it's social upheaval in a lot of ways. What happens to Sir Arthur? Does it kind of dovetail with the rest of England's fortunes, or does he kind of just like go off, have a concussion and a cocktail, and just calls it quits?
No. He continues serving with great distinction and goes on to greater fortune, and ultimately is on the wrong side of the Restoration and dies in prison. And in fact, pretty much everybody in that book meets with a bad end. They die in exile. One dude's beaten to death with his wooden leg. People are drowning. No one does well. In fact, we know about Richard Atkins because he wrote a vindication. I think William Waller also writes a vindication. Lots of people write vindications. Well, why do you need a vindication? You're trying to vindicate yourself because your reputation is destroyed.
Yeah.
So nobody does well. But what I think is so moving and tragic and beautiful, and this is the thing I brought up at the beginning of our conversation, is that like we're living through this current period of intense anxiety, right? Whichever side of the political aisle you're on, I don't think that if you're living in America, you're looking out the window and being like, yeah, things are great,
Yeah.
Everything's going to be fine, we're all pretty nervous. And one of the things I really love is in those moments, again, when I can drop that anxiety and just marvel at the story arc. What the hell are we living through? The same is true at the end of the English Civil War, is that you have this massive, horrible conflict, which just rips up England and is such a source of misery. And the end result is the king comes back.
Mm.
They bring him back. And you're right back to where you were in many, many ways. And this religion, this high episcopacy Anglican religion that the godly, what you would call the Puritans, fought so hard to unseat. Josh, that's the Church of England. I went to services when I was over there. That's what people do.
Yeah.
So it's just beautiful and futile and tragic and amazing. And this is what people do, man. This is what we do. We are bananas. And, look, I wish we killed each other a bit less. That would be nice. But as long as we're up to it, there's nothing we can do but marvel. It's incredible.
Yeah. I think I'm no expert on the English Civil Wars, but just one thing that always sticks with me, I guess, is that in a lot of ways it's more than just a Cromwellian thing, but it seems to last as long as he does. And then once he's gone, this like strong personality and not to make it the great man theory or anything, but like he is what he is, just such a radical dude for the time. Once he's gone, everybody's like, King wasn't so bad, was he? Ship money? Not too bad. Where's the other Charles at?
The thing I will say is, in the 50s, there was a debate in the English Civil War scholarly community called the Storm over the Gentry. And it was settled that this social transfer that I described to you, the rise of professionals, people who could punch at the weight of the aristocracy by dint of skill, rather than just being born into it, was not the reason for the English Civil War. I'll say it's not the only reason. And yes, the England after the English Civil War looked a lot like the one before, with those tragic examples I gave you. But that shift, that people like you and me, that there could be an Elon Musk, that there can be a Donald Trump, that people who are not born, well, actually, I think both Elon Musk and Donald Trump were born into their money. There are self-made people, none are coming to mind. You get the point.
Yep.
But the fact that the idea of social mobility, the idea that, it's so interesting is you look at the Hindu caste system, which this idea that you're born into, I'll never forget. I went on a date in Germany with, I'm still friends with her, actually. We didn't get married because she was taking care of her parents, and I wasn't going to live in Germany, and she wasn't going to move to the United States. So sadly, we did not get married. But I'll never forget, we were at a cafe, and these guys were wearing coveralls with reflective stripes around the ankles. And I was like, what is their job? Thinking that they were, I don't know. And she was like, oh, they're plumbers. Plumbers, what do they have to wear that for? Like, they're plumbers. Plumbers wear jeans. And she goes, well, that's required. And I was like, why? And she goes, honestly, so that university level people know who they are and know not to talk to them.
Mm.
Like that idea of social class and caste, which in the United States we find so anathema, even though it definitely exists here,
yep,
and is so more pronounced elsewhere in the world, that upset to it, right? That isn't the way you and I grew up, that one of us would be a Brahmin and one of us a Kshatriya and whatever. You're seeing that seismic shift in the English Civil War, and the result of the English Civil War, I would argue, is its solidification.
Mm. Well, listen, that's all I've got for this evening. Thank you so much for coming on. This is an absolute treat.
Oh, this was fun, man. Thank you so much. I love talking about this stuff.